Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Agronomists. It's going to be a really great show. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and great to see so many people in the audience already. Shout out to John for the welcome. Scott did beat you to it, though. So hi there, Scott. And thank you, Canadian Cowman, for using your data. to watch us live. Alrighty. So we've got a couple things to go through before we kick off tonight's episode. So as always, remember that you can collect CEU credits for joining us here. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists and fill that out and let us know. We also have Sean gave me a little nudge before the show today to remember that Thursday, our own Bern Tobin and Karen Lewis are going to be hosting a live webinar, 1 p.m. Eastern, on creating win-wins with your PR strategy. So that's going to be a fun one. I'm going to be moderating, I think. I don't know. Jay maybe will tell me in my ear whether or not that's actually true. I don't know. I was invited, so I just assume I'll be moderating. Maybe that's not true. All right. As always, here at the Agronomists, we do have our show sponsors to thank for making this all happen. So we've got Adama Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today. And of course, Real Ag Radio goes Monday to Friday on Rural Radio Channel 147. And I'm hosting tomorrow. So check it out, 4:30 Eastern, or you can catch the replay on realagriculture.com. And of course, Mind Your Farm Business, our farm business podcast. Little known fact, Jay, our producer, actually named that one. He's very talented. Okay, so without further ado, let's get to tonight's show. This is a topic that has been a hot one, especially with crop prices and uncertainty and dry and then some wet and then some supply chain issues. So we're going to talk about last minute or potentially last minute cropping changes, maybe not, and all the factors to consider. And to get through all of your questions tonight, I've got Deb Campbell. She's the owner of Agronomy Advantage. And I've got Anne Kirk, a cereal crop specialist with Manitoba Ag. Welcome here, Anne and Deb.
Hi, Lindsay.
Thanks.
Okay, that was a lot to get through. I feel like I need like a breather. So thank you for waiting patiently. And so wonderful to see everybody in the comments. I'll remind everybody, ask your questions early, ask often so that we can get to them because we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. Absolutely. And yes, that's a pun. So maybe Deb, I'll start with you. Let us know. So you're in the Dundalk Highlands. Is that correct? Somewhere
That's right.
in those. Yeah. What are things like in your neck of the woods right now?
Well, we've actually had a really mild spell this weekend and a nice thaw and, so, a little bit of flooding, which is to be expected with a March thaw, but the water's gotten away pretty well, minimal flooding. So at least in my region or my travels. So pretty pleased to see that. And coming out from under that snow, we have some winter wheat that's it's still there. It's, we got a ways to go here. The big test is the next 4 weeks on wheat, but it's, typical March weather.
So it is not typical compared to last year because I keep getting like the memories pop up of what last year was like.
Yeah.
We were making maple syrup and getting sunburns like this time last year.
Yeah, that sounds about
is
right.
not happening. Yeah, that is not happening this year. All right, Anne, how about in your neck of the woods? Of course, you're in Manitoba. Which part of the province are you based at?
I'm in Carmen, and it is definitely different here. We have a ton of snow, and we haven't had any above zero temperatures in a while. So still lots of snow around, and I think most people have like 6 to 8 foot snow drifts around their houses right now. So lots of melt to get through.
Yeah. You could have used our 12 degrees yesterday that we had here in the Ottawa area. It was weird, but I wouldn't make it not come back. I would be okay with weird. It would be just fine to have 12 degrees. It has made everything kind of mucky. But all right. But of course, this does play into some of the decisions that farmers, of course, are going to have to make in the next while. And as agronomists and cereal specialists, you're going to have to help them make those decisions. So let's maybe start to go into some of the things we do have to consider. I do want to start, maybe Deb, I'll ask you very quickly on sort of the supply side. Last week we talked a lot about some of the supply chain issues with some of the herbicides. Is any of that talk impacting hybrid or variety selection? Are farmers nervous about it? What is that conversation like right now?
Well, no, seeds getting delivered as the weather permits, and we've had a few changes around soybean supply and varieties. We had a miserable fall harvest, and that has impacted some seed supplies. I haven't really heard much in the way of spring corn deliveries, offshore coming in from the south, but um, hopefully north-south channels are still in place and that's not going to see too much interruption. So not a whole lot of factors going on outside of that at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
This is the hope, of course. Now, Anne, as farmers, now I was just going to say, we're getting to the end of, winter conference season, but that sort of didn't happen. So how is that conversation happening really with, what farmers are looking to do this spring? What is that communication mechanism right now? Or do they just bug you on Twitter?
Yeah, a bit of that. And I think that a lot of people, we had a poor, poor harvest this year because of drought conditions. So there was worried about limited seed supplies, back in September. So a lot of people, locked in their seed very early this year. So I'm sure there are some people that are, still making a few last minute cropping decisions. But I think for the most part, those decisions and a lot of seed was sold, even in November. When we put our seed guide out in November, a lot of people had said that, like a lot of the seed growers had said that they've basically sold out already from, some of their cereal crops just because they had lower yields than expected.
We're probably not going to talk a lot about forages tonight, but that is one area where I think supplies could be incredibly tight, depending on what you're looking for. So that's my little nod to all the livestock producers out there who maybe don't get as much credit as they deserve. Although I do have a manure management episode lined up sometime in the next few weeks. So there you go. Okay, so Scott asked a question, and this is maybe one of the things we'll consider. So what we're talking about tonight, of course, is if we're going to swap crops out at the last minute, what do we have to consider? And I say last minute, yes, it's March, but realistically, sometimes the weather turns, sometimes supply changes, sometimes prices change, and we want to make those changes. So Scott will ask his question again because he jumped the gun last week and he had his question a week too soon. So thoughts of pulse on pulse. What about herbicide carryover, disease, nitrogen savings? So we actually have a clip about this, Scott. It's like I knew you were going to ask. But before we go to the clip, let's maybe focus on the herbicide carryover concerns. So this is obviously about pulses, the question, but we can talk about more broadly. How big is the herbicide carryover concern? And maybe I'll start with you in your neck of the woods, and then we can move to Ontario.
Sure. It is definitely a concern, and it really depends on the area of the province. So generally, I think we say about 175, 125 millimeters of precipitation is required to break down those residual herbicides. Some areas were definitely borderline in Manitoba. So I think it really depends on individual people. For the most part, during like August and September, we did receive more precipitation that was able to break down some of those herbicides. But I think in drier regions, it's a concern, and people should reach out to their, consider their cropping options based on what they did spray last year. And I know some companies have released, some information or press releases stating that these specific herbicides could be a risk in some of the drier areas.
So I think part of that question, and Scott, you can chime in here in the comments if you'd like, but I mean, part of the question is, as we look at fertilizer prices, specifically nitrogen, things like soybeans or pulses can perhaps, look a little more appealing, even maybe outside their usual area, or like Scott's suggesting, back onto that same land. So yes, there's a nitrogen consideration, but as you mentioned, there are carryover considerations and potentially disease considerations, which we'll get to in just a minute. So Deb, bit of a different discussion for Ontario, but herbicide carryover and residual is still a concern depending on what you put in the ground.
Oh, absolutely. And it's something that, you want to be aware of just about any time. And anytime we make those last minute changes, that's when it sneaks up and bites you, that you forgot that you had, you had a strong soybean chemistry 2 years ago, and you've planted something that's sensitive to it, whether it's sugar beets or canola or something like that. And that's when it bites you, is when you've forgotten about those details, and you're into a 26-month carryover product or something like that. So it's always prudent to check those details as you're making those switches, and be aware of, have your records of what you've sprayed 2 years ago, and then cross reference it with what you're planning to grow. I mean, crop plans have been very fluid right from the get-go since last November, between the whole roll up of fertilizer pricing, and then everything that's happened and transpired this winter with supply chains. So, I've got some crop plans that are on their fourth or fifth version, just with minor tweaks here and there. Can't get this, so let's use this. And so, yeah, having someone that's knowledgeable, or having a tool that you can refer to that helps you look at those carryover concerns is really important. Yeah, especially if you're growing something that maybe isn't in your typical array. If you decide to swing into edible beans, and you had corn last year, there could be some sensitivities there to some group 27s, for example. And I think we have some rotation charts out of the Guide to Weed Control, if you wanted to put that up, just to show producers. And excellent reference tool from Pub 75, we call it here in Ontario. And most of the common field crops and even horticulture crops are listed with the various herbicides that we're using. So great tool to have.
Yep. Jay, can you bring that up? That's that's one of the charts, right? We'll just give him a second to wake up from his nap. There you go. Just kidding, Jay. He'll pop on here if I annoy him enough. Okay, so here we go. So this is crop rotation. So walk us through maybe. You've got some highlighted numbers here. So what are we worried about here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty busy chart. There's a lot of information on here, but we've got the herbicides down the left and the crops across the top, and depending on which product is influenced most by pH and microbial activity for breakdown, that certainly adds to the length of time that's needed between crops and sensitive crops. And there's often sensitivity around, like I said, edible beans. Canola is another one. Alfalfa can occasionally come into the equation if you're using high rates of atrazine, or you have high pHs and you're using something like Classic. You can look at Comenza, so that has broad strike in it. That's another one that has 26-month carryovers. Even if we get into those high pH scenarios, we can even run into problems with field corn. So, it's not just switching crops. We want to be very cognizant of these types of interactions and make sure we're doing some homework. And sometimes it's even as simple as it's an 11-month rotation. You can see that listed with Callisto and soybeans, and that's tight. If that Callisto is sprayed on June 10th, then you're planting your soybeans on May 1st. Technically, you're right against the wall. And I don't think we have any real unusual circumstances in Ontario this year compared to what they're dealing with in Western Canada. We've had reasonable moisture throughout the entire growing season last year. So I don't expect any surprises outside of these numbers, though. Yeah.
So in that, I mean, that is certainly has been a discussion for some of those areas that are in year 2 or year 3 of extreme dryness. You've mentioned maybe looking back 2 years, but it might be that yes, 2 or maybe even 3 if you've really had that little moisture to activate that microbial activity for sure. So I had no idea this. So Comenza. So again, I've probably never heard of it, but 26 months is a long time. And that's assuming, again, that's assuming sort of regular conditions, average conditions for microbial breakdown, right? So if we were outside of that, it could be longer. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And that's one that, as soon as you start going past 22 or 24 months, all bets are off. Like, people, we forget, right? And it's unfortunate when we find out when the crop emerges and turns purple, and that's not what we want to see. Not on a year like this. Absolutely not. Never, but especially.
Right. So, okay. So I want to, and I know, Anne, you're the cereal specialist, but I do want to run our clip because we've talked about, and Lara in the comments here brought up Aphanomyces. So I'm going to run our pulse clip with Charlene Phelps talking about, tightening up rotations and how, of course, root rot diseases can rear their ugly head. So we'll go to the clip. And when we come back, I do want to talk about some disease considerations as well.
What are some things that growers should keep in mind when it comes to crop selection for the new crop year in light of these root rot issues?
Well, rotations is one of the key things that you can do to manage the root rots, especially when Aphanomyces is involved. So if you have fields that have tested positive for Aphanomyces, you need to be out of peas and lentils for 5 or 6 years. So when you're considering rotations, you want to look at fields where if you have had them tested and Aphanomyces has been tested positive, if you're looking at pea and lentil fields, you want to make sure that there hasn't been a previous pea or lentil field since 4 or 5 years ago. Other things that you can look at to consider is including other pulse crops that have more resistance to Aphanomyces within that rotation.
So what would that ranking scale look like? Peas and lentils would both be fairly equivalent in terms of
Peas and lentils are both equally susceptible to Aphanomyces root rot, but there is other root rot pathogens to also consider, such as Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and Pythium. So there's a complex that can occur, and it can either be one organism or it can be a combination of the organisms. But when we're talking about the severe situations that we've had, a lot of it relates to Aphanomyces, and that's the one that's the most aggressive and the hardest to manage, and that's the one we tend to focus on with peas and lentils because that's the crops that are most susceptible to it.
So what about chickpeas, faba beans, other pulse options?
So other pulse options are, just as you said, chickpeas or faba beans and even soybeans. They are resistant to the Aphanomyces or non-host crops, so they can be included in that 5 or 6 year rotation. When you're trying to stay away from peas and lentils, you could incorporate a chickpea or a faba bean or a soybean, depending on the area of where you're growing the crops.
Okay. But 5 or 6 years, that's a long time.
That is a long time when you're used to growing on peas or lentils on a 3 or 4 year rotation. But that's our best recommendation moving forward, and we've really seen the impact of moving to those longer rotations if you want to ensure successful crops. The other thing that does play a real role is water management. So it's not only choosing what crop you want to put down on a field, it's choosing what field is most suitable for the crop. So fields for peas and lentils are best if they're well drained, a little bit lighter soil, so you're managing the water. So if you can reduce the water, you reduce the risk of Aphanomyces infection as well.
Okay, so very quickly, it is not that Sean won't pay for Starlink, it's that I can't get it yet. So thank you, John. Yes, it sounds like the feed has been lagging a bit. It has been okay for me. I don't know about you, Anne and Deb,
Yep.
but we'll just, okay, Anne, it's been okay. So we'll just keep rolling, and we'll do our best. I do appreciate everybody letting us know, though. I don't know if we all have to like hold still and count to 10. I don't know. So, but either way, we'll just do our best. But please let us know. And no, I know I do have terrible internet, and we're trying. But I don't have Starlink. Okay, so interesting discussion about Aphanomyces. I mean, of course, that is a Western Canadian consideration, far more for pulses than for other things. It does, of course, like many root rots, likes water, and so I'm crossing my fingers that the past few years have maybe been, or at least last year, maybe the year before, weren't so bad for them. But root rots are a concern, obviously, in shorter rotations. And does that hold true for cereals as well? Do you see that being a concern?
Yeah, shorter rotations definitely increases the risk. We have been coming off of 2, maybe 3 drier than normal years. Last year was very dry, so we didn't have a lot of disease issues last year, and any of those soil-borne or residue-borne diseases will, it's less of a risk this year just because of the very low disease levels that we experienced last year. And even for a crop like soybeans, in terms of shortening the rotation or perhaps growing soybeans on soybeans, as I know, that is, quite a few farmers in Manitoba that had dry conditions last year are planning to do that. It is less of a risk coming off of a dry year, the disease risk would be more limited.
So soybean on soybean, because of dry year, what do you think the motivating factor is there?
The
Just to
soil
get away
residual
with it?
nitrogen,
Okay.
just the high nitrogen levels. So any crops like in areas that had a very limited moisture last year, we see very high levels of residual soil nitrogen on those, canola or spring wheat acres. So there's more of a motivation for farmers to, save money by planting a more higher nitrogen using crop on that residual soil, and then just, not wanting to have too high levels of nitrogen for their soybean crop. So I do know that some people are planning to do soybeans on soybeans because of the nitrogen.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Now, Deb, what root rots are the biggest concern, let's say, on those, tight soybean rotations? Because I have a sneaking suspicion we may see some more soybean acres.
Or just a few.
just a few. I'm just throwing it out
Yeah.
there. And we do actually have a really good question about spring wheat that I'll get to in a minute. But focused on soybeans, do we have some concerns that we need to watch for when we're going back to back or back to back to back?
Yes, and yes. We do. And, soybean, I wish, I would love on my wish list to see better genetics when it comes to root rots, better genetic tolerance. And, but we can mitigate that with seed treatments. And I'd say most producers are using fungicide seed treatments in their soybeans. And obviously the best alternative is to rotate. But if this doesn't turn into the biggest soybean acreage in Ontario, I'd be surprised. It'll be one of the top 3 at least anyway. And, certainly given some of the scenarios that have happened in the last week, there's been a few more corn acres squeak over to the soybean column. And of course we have this uphill battle with the winter wheat acres, hopefully better than expected. I'd like to think that, but I'm, it's hard to say what the next 4 weeks will bring. So, soybean root rots, especially those early season ones, I think of Rhizoctonia is one that we see in just about every field, every variety. It's just chronic through our region. And, it's something that soybeans can still grow through. They're just less productive with, some root lesions on it and things. So, yeah, those fungicide seed treatments are really, really important to help balance that out and counteract that.
I just heard Peter Johnson's heart break, Deb. It just smashed, just smashed into 100 pieces. But it is true, right? I mean, we didn't have a remarkable fall for getting wheat in.
No.
Right. And so there are some acres that might end up not. I mean, there's always acres that don't make it, right? So.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, but, last fall was pretty unique, where we had just tremendous rainfall through the month of October. So even the early wheat that was planted had significant effects from being in saturated waterlogged soils for such a long period of time. And that's atypical. We don't normally see that. I do think that we'll see that come through reasonably well, but it all quite often comes down to the next 4 weeks. These, what makes a really good sap running season is quite often very difficult and challenging to winter wheat survival in the spring, and winter canola and winter barley for that matter. So and that all comes down to what happens in the next 4 weeks.
Well, right now we're in my neck of the woods. It looks gross. So maybe that's good for the wheat crop. I don't know. All right. So John says, so here's a quick question. What price does hard red spring wheat have to be to buy my acres out of corn so that I can then plant a cover crop? Well, I would like to, here's my answer. If you really need a cover crop, then easy peasy, just do it. But what price is that? And at this point, if it hasn't hit it yet, is it going to? Because goodness, how much higher does it have to go, John? Anyway, Deb, do you have a stab at that? Maybe someone in the comments could make an educated guess on what
I don't have a real number, a hard number, but the challenge, at least in Ontario's perspective, is spring wheat is it's really limited to the lower heat unit zones and Northern Ontario to get good production. And, even it's quite challenging to have excellent production with spring wheat that can outcompete corn. So not likely to happen from an Ontario perspective. I doubt it anyway.
Okay. Well, people can dream, right?
Yep.
Now, so Anne, this is an interesting one because, of course, so I grew up in Manitoba. There are some winter wheat acres, but in Western Canada in general, not a lot. But of course, tons and tons of spring acres. What has the shift been in the past couple of years with these dry conditions, specifically in Manitoba?
In terms of crop acreage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're seeing just in general, winter wheat acres have generally been decreasing year over year. And I think we were down to somewhere around 25 to 30,000 acres last year of winter wheat. We are seeing definitely more fall rye. So it's nice to see some fall crops increasing in acreage.
Mm-hmm.
I think the trend has probably been partly because of yields of winter wheat versus spring wheat. In recent years, they've been fairly similar, and then prices of spring wheat versus winter wheat. So if the price is better and the yields are comparable, and also harvest timing with these hot, dry summers, sometimes, we see winter wheat harvest and then spring wheat harvest happening a few days or a week later. So some of those benefits just haven't been there, but perhaps, with better genetics or higher winter wheat acre yields, we'll see a pushback to winter wheat.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so Warren, Farmer Schneck out in Eastern Ontario here, not far from me, but apparently in a much warmer area, because if you saw his pictures on Facebook, almost all his snow disappeared in this last warm spell, and I still have lots, so Warren, come and get it. He says they're predicting a cold, wet spring, which, yes, that's what my forecast says. How long into May do you push to get spring wheat in when feed wheat is valued above $12 a bushel? So Deb, maybe that one's for you. What's the window for pushing for spring wheat?
Well, as soon yeah, I mean, you don't really want to go by the calendar, but I wouldn't be all that positive on May planted spring wheat in higher heat unit zones like where Warren is, but certainly in the lower heat unit zones, Northern Ontario, first week of May is quite a common planting window. So earlier is better. You can start clocking some yield deficits pretty quick when you roll into May in some higher heat unit zones. And as a true cash crop, it's probably a little bit further down the list compared to corn and soybeans for a lot of producers. That said, I think we're going to see some of the biggest oat acres in Ontario than we've seen. Just a tremendous drive towards oat acres. Yeah, it's showing up on my crop plans quite significantly, and so we'll see how that all comes together. Folks are eyeing up some early planting for oats, and lots of potential to make some money off that oat crop this year if everything goes well.
Interesting. So what market is driving that?
The food market,
Yeah.
but both food and feed. We've had smaller acres last year. It tends to offset the wheat cycle. So this particular region did not get their wheat planted last fall. Like we were down. I think we maybe only got about a third of the wheat acres planted. So that leaves a lot of cereal acres to be planted, and oats would be the first choice for a lot of producers, and spring wheat right behind that. And yeah, I mean, there's also the straw market driving those cereal acres as well. Big straw market.
I heard over the weekend talk of 12 cents a pound in the windrow for straw right now. Right?
Yeah.
And I was like, I need to grow some. Anyway, Farmer Schneck says, so I asked what's driving that. He said the oat market, Lindsay. That's what's driving oat planting. Thanks, Warren. This just in. Okay, he wants my job, I think. Okay, so quick question on chickpeas south in Manitoba this year, it looks like. Anne, have you heard of chickpeas going in Manitoba?
I have heard of people trying them in the far southwest corner of Manitoba.
Really?
I don't have a lot of, experience with that, but
No.
yeah, we have a research center out in Melita, which is like the southwest corner, and they have been doing experiments with chickpeas. So maybe we'll see more of it, and if these dry years continue.
I don't know. You just said you had 6 to 8 foot snowdrifts. That doesn't sound very dry. I'm just putting that out there. I know that's not in Melita, but I'm just saying. Yeah, that's not. It doesn't seem conducive to chickpea growing anyway. But we'll see. I suppose there's all sorts of neat things we can talk about. Okay, so I do want to. And Jason Vote says winter wheat acres have gone down. Now Jason's out at Carmen as well. It's as much a diva as canola, he says. I don't.
Oh,
That's see, Deb agrees with me. That's a
whoa,
slight.
Jason.
Yeah, it's. I thought that diva. I thought the corn crop was the diva, but there we go. Anyway, yes, it's a delicate flower, and we didn't even get into how ugly faba beans are. As like the bean itself is ugly, but the plant is beautiful. Anyway, so now Jason does nudge. So Anna, I'll ask you this. I know you are the cereal specialist, so we can talk about oats too. But huge oat acres. Is there more processing happening in Manitoba that's driving some of that oat acreage as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. We have seen like a new plant was built near Winnipeg. I think it came into production last year, Richardson plant. So yeah, and I think there's been a couple new processing facilities announced. So we have seen a big increase in oat acres. And in our the farm business specialist with the government put together a guide to crop production costs, and they've rated oats as number one in terms of profitability for the 2022 season based on their yield and price projections. So I think that, yeah, based on the demand for oats and expected prices, they are projected to be very profitable this year.
So that's interesting. Although I was like, oh, because of oat milk, but I discovered that there's very little oats in oat milk. Just spoiler alert for all y'all out there. I know. I was surprised too. I was like, isn't this great? We have a like made in Canada dairy alternative beverage, but no, I mean, yes, it is, but there's very little oats in it. So there you go.
So what's the rest of it?
Right? I gotta wonder. Pretty sure it's mostly water. So just maybe stick with milk. But it does make me a little nervous. Now you did mention there is more processing, and obviously there's food demand. I mean, Quaker's a big buyer. Like there is a big demand for oats, but it is one of those markets that it does make me a little nervous if everybody thinks they should grow oats. It is a market we can oversupply relatively easily.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers as of this year, but as of 2 years ago, in terms of like oat acreage and processing capacity in Manitoba, we had more capacity to mill oats than we actually had acres, and that doesn't take into account oats sold for feed or that didn't make milling quality. So right now, I think like at least in Manitoba, we're okay, and we've heard of another new plant in Saskatchewan as well. So, but that is always a risk of saturating the market.
Mm-hmm. Deb, what about out your way? Where does it mostly go?
I mean, a fair bit of it'll go to Peterborough, for milling oats, and then the sheep market takes in a lot of oats in their feed ration as well. Yep, it's a lot.
Not my sheep.
In this region.
I guess if they were cheap and plentiful, I would feed them too. I guess I don't know. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of oats around. Yeah, there you go. Okay, that's interesting. Yep. I had no idea. And now there's the cover crop market too, I would assume too, right? For seed. Yeah.
That might be a little bit. I actually have no sense of how big that market is. To be honest,
well, I don't either. I'll mark it down for things I should look into. That's going on my. You should see how long that list is. It's a long one, but I'm going to look into it because yes. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit too, because I want to make sure. Jay just noted that oat milk is cloudy garbage water, is what he just called it. Yeah, that's ouch. Okay, so I do want to go, and I know, hold on to your hats, everybody. We're going to our second clip, but I want to dig into a little bit deeper into the rotation choices we make and the impact they have on the year and the year following. So a little bit beyond just fertilizer or carryover, those sorts of things. There are, of course, some pretty key impacts in just diversity in our crop rotation. So I want to bring that in. So Jay, if we can go to the clip. Yes, I think it's the correct one that talks about the value of wheat in rotation?
A crop rotation, if you change a crop rotation, that means we're changing a system of variables. And so as soon as we change a system of variables, we really have to take into consideration all the factors that are changing. And then in the system, because when we're thinking about the corn enterprise, we have to also think about, well, what would happen to the soybean enterprise if we change something in the corn? Or if we start planting wheat, what will happen to the corn and soybean enterprises if we start planting wheat? And so that's really the true value of these long-term trials, is that we get to assess or determine the responses to other factors or other crops in the rotation. So our research has shown that if we plant wheat in the rotation, have a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, our corn yields are between 6 and 17 bushel per acre higher if we plant wheat in the rotation compared to just a corn soybean rotation. So that is very incredible in terms of the performance of the corn, and soybeans between 4 and 6 bushel per acre more if we plant wheat in the rotation. So that's incredible, because if these corn and soybean enterprises are yielding more, that means the profitability should be given to the wheat part, the wheat enterprise. And so this
Peter Johnson would be happy to hear that.
That's right, and he didn't pay me to say this. He doesn't pay me at all. So if the wheat is enhanced, that means that we should give the credit where credit is due and give that credit to the wheat enterprise. And this could influence our decision. Should I plant wheat or should I not plant wheat? This could move us to the direction that, hey, wheat is more important than we thought, considering other factors in the rotation.
So much to talk about. Soil health, obviously. I want to talk about nitrogen. I mean, your corn actually does a lot better in a longer rotation because it's utilizing that nitrogen better.
Yes, it's utilizing the nitrogen better, and our data shows that the soil quality is that much better where wheat is included in the rotation. The soil quality is better, the total nitrogen content of that soil is higher where we have wheat in the rotation. This is not including red clover yet. And that ability, that enhanced nitrogen, better soil structure, probably just enhances the corn rooting depth and scavenging ability of that corn, and so it's more nitrogen efficient. But with wheat in the rotation, we're allowed, or it enables us to include, let's say, a red clover cover crop into rotation, and that enables us to grow some of our own nitrogen, which saves on nitrogen costs as well. And if we didn't have wheat in the rotation, it would be very difficult to get a nitrogen credit from red clover, let's say, in a corn soybean rotation.
All right. Dr. Dave Hooker gets to talk about wheat, and that's how excited he gets. And yes, it probably mended Pete's broken heart about the acres. I want to let everybody know, if you head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists, you will find the post, the write-up that goes with this clip. And I will link to that video in the post, because I don't know about you, but those graphs that Dr. Dave put up are really neat, but you need to pause them to actually read them. They're not on the screen long enough. That's a shout out to Jay, our producer. Next time, leave them on longer. Just kidding. I know you can't, you don't have a time machine that I know of, so you can't fix that. Anyway, but they are really neat. You can hit pause, you can take a look at them, all those sorts of good things, because there are some great ones there. But this is where I want to spend it. I want to dig in a little bit and talk about the power of rotation, in that, we talked a bit about root rots, Deb. We can talk about leftover soil nitrates from last year from a dry year, but realistically, there's a value in rotation every year. How much of that conversation comes in when you're making those cropping plans, Deb? You've said it's changed maybe 4 or 5 times already for some growers. How much does the value of rotation work its way into that talk?
It's a fundamental piece of that talk, that conversation. And, I think that message is getting out there. It's getting absorbed. When you look at those graphs, purely by having wheat in the rotation, you're adding, roughly 10 bushels more corn and 5 bushels more bean. I mean, you really don't have to do a whole lot of anything extra to be more profitable other than having wheat in the rotation. And there's so much more that wheat brings to the rotation beyond just yield increases. So it's a foundational piece of a crop plan, ensuring that producers are considering, the downside of deviating from their rotation. It's more that there's upside of having your rotation. There's penalties of not having it. And, sometimes there is some justification, logistical things, and, you need to get tiling done or whatever the case might be. So you go to a short season bean or something, but new land, things like that. But for the most part, if the wheat's coming out, ideally it's going to go back into either corn or a cereal in order to maintain that part of the rotation as best possible, and not hopefully flip too many of those wheat acres or the non-planted wheat acres right back into beans. But
So
I
guess
we are seeing
that's
it.
that's one follow-up, of course, is that, so let's say, right, that winter wheat crop doesn't make it, and you are going to take it out. Although I've definitely talked to some farmers who said as long as it looks mediocre, it's staying, because the prices are good enough, right? That as long as it's decent, it's staying.
Yeah, in my experience, though, as long as it's thin universally across an entire field, that's one thing. But when it's patchy, the farmers won't even wait to see if there's any amount of recovery in some of those patches. It's just gone. And one of the challenges from our late planting from last fall, a lot of acres went in November, so well outside of the optimum window. And those late seeded fields, they take weeks and weeks to green up in the spring. Like it's often, at least the 1st of May before you really have a good handle on what that wheat stand looks like. And gosh, it's hard to drag your feet that long to get folks to wait that long to really have a good handle on it. I find they pull the plug prematurely in a lot of cases, and we don't want to do that if we don't have to. But those backup plans are already built into the crop plan, that if the field doesn't make it, or if this field doesn't make it, it's going to go to whatever the case might be. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it is soybeans. So, yeah.
And I mean, for plenty of reasons, and we understand that, but right, this is where that what else could you plant put in there that might stick closer to that rotation as opposed to going back to beans. Now, Anne, you've got a really great graph that we can look at as well. And I remember years ago being at the agronomy conference in December, that's at the U of M, looking at some of the work that had been done on trying to put sort of that dollar value on rotation. And of course, Manitoba and even Western Canada in general really enjoys a lot of cropping options. I mean, in Ontario, where we pat ourselves on the back for 3 crops, but I think there's probably some 6 crop rotations, maybe 7 in some parts of the West, which is pretty neat, but a lot to manage. But what is the story there with trying to navigate some of the cropping options and the value of rotation?
Yeah, I guess if you could pull up there's a slide.
I think Jay is trying to find it.
Okay,
or maybe
slide 1.
Stalled. Yeah. There we go. Ta-da!
Okay, so this is so we are very lucky in that we have a lot of data from our crop insurance, provincial crop insurance, in terms of some crop rotation information. So this is a chart just looking at yield response to crop sequence. So it's not crop rotation, but just when a specific crop is planted on a previous crop, what is the yield benefit or penalty? So the top bar is the crop planted, and on the left-hand side, we have the previous crop. So all the yellow bars in the middle are crop on crop, so oat on oat, canola on canola, and we always see a penalty when a crop is planted on the same crop. And then the green highlights are when we see above average yields for that specific crop sequence. So what we do see in general is that crops planted on a different crop type will almost always see that yield benefit. So, a cereal planted on a pulse crop or an oilseed crop, or vice versa, we do tend to see yield benefits there. So just, something that we all know, but it's good to see the data behind it to confirm that when possible, those are the best cropping options, is to at least rotate crop types.
What does the green point out? Although I think I found the highest number because that was the first thing I was trying to find is which crop is the best after the other. But what does the green signify? Like
the green is just over average yields, so over 100% of yield.
Yeah,
so that on average we'd see a higher relative yield with the green. And I did want to point out that this is our crop sequence effect, and there are some very high numbers. I think the highest was flax on peas. But in some of those like smaller acreage crops, the data is less reliable because fewer fields went into that. So I do have another slide that looks at what percent of the actual acres were seeded to flax on peas, and I think it was 1%. So
oh, there you go. Oh, yeah, this tells a bit of a different story because I was also looking at the navy beans on potato ground. And it's also 126%, but there's only 3%.
And and I highlighted in yellow here where the crop types that are most common. So canola, most often planted on spring wheat. Flax, most often planted on spring wheat. So you do see those more like most common crop rotations. And we do know in Manitoba, at least as of a few years ago, roughly half of the fields are planted to canola or spring wheat after just a 1-year break in that crop type. So while we do have lots of cropping options, we do tend to see the same crops planted more often than they probably should be.
As Rennie Van Ackerd would call it, canola snow, but there's no money in snow. So canola wheat, it alternates, it's not a rotation. Right.
And there is one more slide, I think it's the next one, that I think is interesting in terms of it just shows the most profitable break. So this is showing it's small numbers, but it's interesting to see. So for example, each graph shows the yield response to say spring wheat grown like on spring wheat with a 1-year break, 2-year break, 3-year break. So we see in general that it took a 3-year break. So in flax, peas, sunflowers, and soybeans, it does take a 3-year break between the same crop types to see a positive yield response. So any of the orange bars is show higher than average annual crop in more than 80% of the crops analyzed. So orange is positive, blue, you can see some of them are positive, but it's not a huge benefit. So it is nice to see this data to show, for the crops that you should be having a longer rotation between.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a few people in the comments are looking for some of these charts, so I'll try and link to as many of them as I can. John says, I assume this chart is a 1-year comparison. Is there data for 2 through say 5 or even 10? John, I'm not sure which chart you mean. So maybe just clarify that. But very quickly, and I don't think it's this one. I think he means the other one. But no, that's based on several years' data, right?
That's 10 years of data.
Yeah. Okay. And that shows, and then the second chart showed us sort of the frequency of how many times we had data from a crop following a crop based on crop data.
Within that 10-year period.
Right. Okay.
And this chart is 16 years of data, so it's quite a big data set.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. And so I will try and link to as many of these as I can in the post, or if anybody wants to just reach out directly to me, and I can always connect the two of you to do that. But Jason does have a question, which I think is a really good one, and he prefaces it with, it's a serious question, so now we know he means business. So thank you, Jason, for that little hat tip there, that I know you're serious. But serious question, if you're, potentially talking to a grower, and Deb, I mean, this goes to you as well. Do you get concerned if someone is highly leveraged, let's say, in a crop with a limited market, and try to steer them to perhaps diversifying their crop mix for the year, somewhat? And maybe you go first, and then Deb.
Yeah, I think definitely diversity is important. And one thing we saw in Manitoba this year for oats, for example, which is interesting, is that oats require more water to produce a bushel of grain. So we did see more of a yield reduction in oats compared to our long-term average this year than we saw for wheat or barley. So that really highlights the importance of diversifying rotations, that if all of your cereal acres were in oats, you would definitely have more of a penalty from the dry conditions we saw last year.
Very cool. Deb, what about you? How do you sort of go through that conversation of potentially maybe getting too far in on any one thing? Do you have, okay, maybe this isn't fair. Have you ever heard of someone going wall to wall beans and have more than like 2,000 acres?
Oh yeah,
Is-
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Every time, every year.
Okay. I thought I
Yeah.
was being out there, but apparently not. Okay.
No, those are not uncommon actually, farms with
All right.
that. So, but some of it is agronomic and some of it is just downright logistical, right? And if there's if there's good justification, if you will, that makes sense, that it's thought through, that they're lopsiding their rotation one way or another. Significant growth in a business sometimes comes into play, or a year like this where the profitability swings things or skews things a little bit. You kind of take those with a grain of salt, but the logistics that I find tends to be the limiting factor as much as anything. So thinking through staggering planting dates when you're doing that, thinking through staggering your maturities if you're lopsiding your, if you're growing all one variety from start to finish and it goes in the ground all in 7 days, take soybeans, for example, you have a nightmare at harvest. There's no way around that. And your beans are sitting there mature, ripe, waiting. And, then we get into a scenario like last year and we can't get them off in good shape. So I see that play out time and time again. And so just coaching around, various practices to help mitigate some of the risk that goes with that. And, I have producers that grow 4,000 acres plus soybeans, and that is 2/3 of their crop rotation. And, they're some of the best bean growers in Ontario. And, it just comes down to knowing what you're doing and managing for some of those risks.
Right. Oh, now Peter asked the question, which this is an interesting, I've never thought about it this way. So, but in coming back to that conversation about, potentially the wheat not making it, what do you go into? Peter asks, corn on corn or soy on soy, which way is better to get the farm back to the 3-crop rotation? That's an interesting discussion.
My go-to is usually soybeans. It's kind of benign in a rotation when it comes to correcting your rotation, if you will, because we can put just about anything behind soybeans in rotation. It can go into a cereal, it can go into corn. For me, it's the default that's relatively easy to produce, can go on, a staggering amount of acres and be managed. And and then you can circle back around and get back into corn or a cereal, depending on what you're needing to do. So it's kind of my default. Yeah, corn would be much more difficult in some areas of the province, maybe not all areas of the province, but it's in the ground from April till November. So you don't have a lot of extra options there.
Mm-hmm. I just want to point out that Wayne Thompson has entered the chat. And if anyone knows Orange Wayne, he would like to point out, Anne, that he is very pro that you used orange bars to signify good for flax. And anyone who knows Orange Wayne will know that he loves orange, but he also loves flax. And he is very conflicted, but also very happy that blue and orange go well together. So, hi, Wayne. It's great to see you there. Okay, so John wants to follow up, and I think this is a good question. Jay, can we go back to that first graph of Anne's about the crop insurance data about year following a year? Because I think this is important to sort of just, let's hammer this out a little bit, but some of it you might just have to dig into later. So this is, what does it say? 9 years that this is compiled. So yield responses, but this is, and just walk us through it one more time. This is the impact of the crop following the previous crop. But he's asking, what about like the next year? That's not what this is. This is just showing the year after.
Yeah, a crop following a specific crop. Yeah, I don't have the same graph for, like all those different crop rotation options.
But then your third one sort of gets to that point in a way of showing you the longer break has more of a benefit for certain crops. So some crops really benefit from that longer break more than others.
Yeah, so this gets into more of the rotation just in terms of the break years between each specific crop.
Okay, Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. So, John, I hope that's somewhat more clear. I love, if you want to put in a request for year 2 and year 3 rotation data, then I guess we'll just keep working on that. And, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So we'll just keep looking. It is actually fascinating.
I was going to say, if I could jump in, I mean, I find
Sure.
this data quite fascinating. I like how it's presented, but it almost justifies the spring wheat canola rotation, which is not really what you want to do. But
Well, there's a reason it
Yeah, that
happens.
one year break between spring wheat, yeah, it does justify it a bit more than we probably would like to promote.
But we're not, the data is the data. We're not supposed to
Yep.
pick favorites and tell it what it's supposed to tell us. So
Yeah.
it just happens. Yeah, so there you go. That's but we'll put in a request for other ones. I will say though, and if John or anyone else has some time to dig through the corn school and the wheat school, Dr. Dave Hooker has done well, and the soybean school, I guess, because I think we do one every couple of years. They've got some really great long-term rotational data, and we saw just a glimpse of it in that clip with Dr. Hooker. But there is some longer term that does actually look into what happens like in year 6 and year 7, I'm pretty sure, when you sort of stick to these more complex rotations, and does quantify that data. And one of the things, I mean, he mentioned it, but we've done whole schools on that conversation as well, is, where do you credit that advantage? Does the corn crop that is 17 bushels higher, is that because it's the corn crop, or is it because the wheat was in rotation? So sometimes we tend to think in 1 year and not think in the 3 years, and really the wheat is the one that's adding that extra value, not the soybeans or not the corn crop itself. So that was actually another conversation that was a couple of years ago, was on when you're doing cropping budgets, you should really be looking at more than 1 year. You should really be looking at 3 or even 5 year. You should be looking at a full rotation cropping budget, and so that you're fair to each crop, right? So, Deb, have you
Yeah.
ever done that?
Yep.
Have you ever looked at like a 6 year or 9 year sort of like budgeting?
Budget? No, I haven't, but I do have some producers that have looked, they've got their spreadsheets laid out, that they can go back for, a 9 or 12-year cycle and look at the big picture. And more often than not, it justifies their 3-way rotation. And I think that data set that Dr. Hooker was using in there is, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, I want to say 28 years of data, but a lot of that is following that 3-year rotation by the time it settles out to those averages. So lots of justification in that data set for the wheat and the rotation. And ultimately, we put it on the wheat part of the balance sheet and not on the corn or the beans. And it's the same thing in Ontario when we're growing canola or edible beans and wheat. We do grow better wheat behind both of those crops, and technically the value should go to the initial crop as well, but it's however producers choose to justify it, I guess.
Absolutely. Or if you're going to grow edible beans or navy beans after potatoes, apparently, way to go potatoes. Okay. So Pete does have a question now, and this has definitely come up, and edible beans are of course grown in Manitoba as well, but there has been talk about edible bean acres being down with the prices as they are for soybeans, and swapping out some of those edible bean acres into soybeans. Deb, are you hearing that conversation? What would a farmer sort of take into account?
Oh, it's kind of, we're in a bit of a window of buyer's remorse. So confirming your black bean contract back in December, and now this run up on soybean prices makes that black bean acre look less profitable compared to, say, 60 bushel soybeans, if they are using that value in their spreadsheet. So there is a bit of buyer's remorse on some of those edible bean contracts, which is really unfortunate. But we did see last year with the reduced acres of edible beans that, producers can contract 1,500 weight up front, and then, they take whatever the market price is in the fall on their final delivery. And last year, the market price was actually higher on delivery, and that's unusual. We don't often see that. I don't want to suggest that that's going to happen again this year, but I suspect it may have to in order to keep those acres long term.
Absolutely. There's certainly been some discussion about even IP beans as well, losing out some of those acres as well.
Yeah, but you know what?
Yeah.
My IP bean acres are just as strong as they've always been. It seems, with the evolution of IPs in Ontario, if you're an IP bean grower, you're an IP bean grower, and that's their production system that they're in, and for the long haul for some of those producers, and they don't jump out, just because they're at $20 beans or something.
Well, and especially something like IP beans, you do plan for it all the years you're not growing it on that field, right? I mean,
That's right.
you're
Yep.
thinking about, what you can use, what weeds you need to get ahead of before the IP beans go in and whatever. So it's not that easy necessarily to just jump out. I would imagine that could be very costly in the long term for sure.
Yeah, that one takes, it takes the benefit of a lot of planning and making sure we have good weed control, throughout the entire rotation, things like that. Yeah, for sure.
All right, Scott's got an interesting question here, Anne. I'll ask it, and it might be somewhat philosophical, but we'll see where it goes. Something to ponder: does the fact that you're basing data on mainly wheat canola, does that bias the outcome to make it seem like it's an advantage?
That's a good question. Yeah, having more data points definitely changes. Yeah, it is definitely something to think about.
Right, because this is
Yeah.
that was all crop insurance data, right? Like that's taking data that exists and compiling it and looking at it, not creating a study that tries to
Yeah,
take
no,
certain
that's
factors
just
out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's just like real world crop sequence effects. So yeah, obviously the more data points, the more accurate the data is. So I don't know if I don't think you're really biasing towards it, but I think it just means that you can be more confident in the results when, you're looking at wheat, canola, and soybeans, some of those higher acreage crops for sure.
Absolutely.
An additional thought on that is that if in fact that is the preferred rotation, let's say, for growers, they manage it better. And that probably influences those numbers a little bit too, I would imagine.
And I mean, and Pete pointed out, so in areas where club root is an issue, that has already essentially changed some of those rotations. And sclerotinia, of course, is an issue. And to your point, Deb, it's exactly right. Those are things that those farmers are already preparing for, penciling it in, watching for, scouting for, and they've already got everything booked and ready to go to make sure they're protecting those plants. So it is true. Everything is a trade-off, right? If you know you're going to have to manage for some of those risks and you do your planning and your logistics, then away you go. So can still be super successful in some of these tighter rotations. I guess you just have to define your level of success. So there you go. Everybody can do that. Okay, we are out of time. Anne and Deb, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me and taking all these questions. We missed a whole discussion about dipping shortbread in scotch. And this is, I saw it happening and I wanted to jump in, but I just didn't know where it fit in crop rotation. So apparently it's a thing. So says Ray DeBenko. So there you go. Dipping shortbread in scotch. That sounds
Nice.
very Scottish, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
The
maybe
Campbell
we'll have to try
approves.
that one day. Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Deb, for joining me on the Agronomist tonight. Thank you to our show sponsor, Agronomy Canada, as well. Do check out everyone if you can on Thursday. Hop on our live stream at 1 p.m. Eastern to hear from Bern and Karen. The freezing today on my screen has just been stellar. I really hope some of you get some great screenshots out of this. All right. Thank you to my guests, of course, and thanks to everyone in the comments for following along. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Make sure you let us know that you've watched and get those CEU credits. All right. And next week, we're going to talk about some planting speed and population counts looking at corn, soy, and canola. So join us next week, 8 p.m. Eastern. Cheers, everybody.